Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm based in East Vancouver. I work for Sierra Club BC. Our office is in Victoria, but I'm the only staff person based in Vancouver, in the territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam nations. And I will give a short presentation to remind us all about the urgency of making changes and how we manage our forests. And then we will go through the different points and suggestions how you can respond to the input and to the invitation of the BC government to share your views. Before we do that, I didn't know until a minute ago that Brenda Sayers is in the room, and I would like to suggest that we take a moment to hear from Brenda before I talk, since we are all guests on the territories of Indigenous peoples. I think that would be wonderful if we can take a moment for that before I go through my presentation. And I make sure that I will not use too much time for my presentation afterwards.
Okay, Jens, here is Brenda. He's invited you to say a few words.
Oh, you did?
Well, I made the suggestion. I'm not sure if I'm in a position to invite you, but I think that since we have you, it would be wonderful if you could say a few words, since we are all guests in your territories.
Okay, sure, I could do that. Well, I just would like to say to everyone welcome this evening. I ran in your riding in the last federal election, North Island Powell River, the federal election. So some of you are familiar to me. I'm from the Hoopachaset First Nation, which is in Port Alberni. And I have a great interest in what's taking place tonight because recently they logged my family's sacred site. So I went through a loss of my father and kind of was in hibernation for a while. But after that happened, it kind of lit something inside of me that said that something had to be done about the logging going on. And for me, it's not just about old growth. It's about our forests in general and the effect that the amount of logging that they're doing and the effect that it's having on climate change. And I'm really happy to be here tonight to be part of this process and filling out this form. I'm going to encourage as many people as I can in my territory to fill it out. And, you know, I was also up in the Mint Valley, which is a place close to my heart as well, on the stump of a 1,000-year-old tree. So that was 2 heartbreaks in a short period of time within our traditional lands. So I'm really interested in working with people like Jens from Sierra Club, Ancient Forest Alliance. Our family is contemplating doing a press release on the logging of our area. We've been talking with our chief and council. I would like Sierra Club support in that when we go forward. And doing some other work on my own with this logging that we have to, you know, watch every day. You walk out the door and you can see spots on the mountain that are and it's not our home anymore. You know, we should be able to walk out our door and feel good about what's there in the natural surroundings. So, yeah, I just thank you for Jens for giving me a few minutes, and I just want to say thank you to everybody that's here that takes an interest in the work that needs to be done.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. Should I start? And thanks.
Yes, Jens.
Thanks again for joining us tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about the forest, climate, and biodiversity crisis that we are in, and As Brenda said, this is also a social justice issue. This is about the cultural values, and it's really heartbreaking how over the course of the last 150 years we destroyed so much of these forests that are thousands of years old. So I'm going to jump in with a very new photo from the Schmidt Creek area. Many of you heard about this BCTS logging close to the Robson Bight Ecological Reserve and the globally unique Orca rubbing beaches. This is what I would describe as extreme old growth logging, because this is not sustainable, and we're seeing companies moving towards the last percentage points of ancient forest, and we are not allowing the young forests to grow old again. So this is not sustainable. We are not leaving the same values for future generations. And we really have very little time left to turn things around. We live in a globally unique context. The temperate rainforest never covered more than half a percentage point of the planet's landmass, and they are spectacular ecosystems. So as John Whalen, good book, The Golden Spruce, said, a coastal forest can be an awesome place to behold. Huge, holy, and eternal feeling, like a branched and needled Notre Dame. And people all around the world were upset when Notre Dame burned a few months ago, but we have to step up to the plate and to protect what remains of our ancient cathedrals here on the coast of British Columbia. This is just a word of my background. This is a photo from Sumatra, where I investigated pulp and paper companies, and I often find myself reminded of the destruction that we see in tropical rainforests when I see the clear cuts on Vancouver Island. This is just a reminder that it's our global responsibility to help protect the lungs of the planet, just like we are hoping that tropical countries will protect tropical rainforests, and they are struggling with much bigger challenges. Many of these nations are poorer and have bigger populations that are struggling to survive, and so we really have to inspire the rest of the world. And you all know that there are unique plants and animal species, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but we will lose these critters, we will lose the web of life unless we protect both old growth forests and make sure that we have intact forest landscapes where we move away from destructive logging where forestry happens. And the cultural values, the culturally modified trees, the hundreds of different ways how indigenous peoples have used these forests for thousands of years. We are at great risk of losing all of that because these diverse uses cannot happen in young forests with a greatly diminished ecological diversity. So we're looking at the lungs of the planet, and we're looking at the climate crisis here. This is a reminder about the fall report from the IPCC. The key message: we have about 12 years. By 2030, we have to massively reduce emissions, or we will hit all kinds of dangerous limits. And this is only possible if we change how we manage our forests, how we look after our forests. There's no way to achieve these reductions without stopping deforestation and the massive loss of carbon from degradation. And all of this is now happening in the context of climate impacts, like the fire situation in August 2018. So we're losing more and more forests as a result of climate impacts, and we have to work harder to hold on to those forests that remain relatively resilient, like the coastal rainforest. The emissions from forests, from destructive logging, from insects, from fire are going up, and they are not counted. So on the left here, we have the 60 million tons of official emissions, primarily related to the use of fossil fuels. And then in the middle, we have between 20 to 80 million tons of uncounted annual emissions, average annual emissions in the last 10 years or so. In the last 2 years, 2017, 2018, these went up as a result of catastrophic fires. And we really have to hope that we get a break from those fires, and we have to do everything we can to change the way we manage our forests, including to reduce the risk of fire, leaving deciduous trees growing, and allowing diverse landscapes where some thinning is needed, but not clear cuts. Clear cuts, including in the interior, will only make things worse, including for future fires. So globally, we had about half of the land covered with forests thousands of years ago, and today this is reduced to about 30%, and we have already lost 120 billion tons of carbon over the course of these thousands of years as a result of forest deforestation and degradation. Today we know more than ever before about how many trees we have on the planet. 3 trillion is the best estimate. And there's no other country in the world that has more trees per capita than Canada. We have about 9,000 trees in Canada for every person in this country. And globally, deforestation is a big challenge, but also degradation. So all forms of reducing the forest to a shadow of its former self. So destructive logging, industrial logging, increasingly climate impacts like fire and insects, those are all forms of degradation. There's still some form of forest, but it's not the same forest. And this was a study from 2013 looking at 12 years of deforestation and degradation. They found 150 million hectares globally lost to deforestation and 100 million hectares lost to degradation. And that's where Canada was the #1 country, contributing 20% to global degradation as a combination of these things, of clear cutting, fire and other impacts. And again, temperate rainforests are particularly outstanding, and we have a global responsibility for these because they have very high carbon storage per hectare. On all these world maps, they show in the top because very high amounts of carbon per hectare, and also the tallest trees on the planet if we leave these forests alone. And if we look at BC maps, we see that climate scientists expect massive shifts in many landscapes, particularly grasslands becoming greater, covering more parts of BC, moving into landscapes where previously we had forests. The only part of the province where things could stay relatively stable if we fight climate change successfully would be along the coast. So again, if we want some trees to breathe oxygen, have water, we have to start looking at those old growth forests along the coast and in the interior wet belt inland rainforest. And we have to distinguish between those ecosystems that are relatively resilient. We have to help them to remain resilient. And then some ecosystems are now so hard hit by climate impacts that we have to help with transition. We have to allow other tree species to play a bigger role and things like that. And then we have those that are in between these extremes where we have to help a little bit with resistance, and that needs careful planning. We cannot allow companies to log everything after a fire or an insect outbreak, because there will always be some trees that are still alive and that can help with the recovery. We have to help them, not clear cut the damaged forest. We know that old growth forests, the majority of the old growth forests absorb more carbon than they lose. They are not dying forests like industry wants to tell us. And we have data that shows that they continue to sequester more carbon. in temperate regions about 2 tons per carbon additionally. So they continue to sequester. That's like having money in the bank. That's a lot of carbon stored in the forest, and they continue to sequester carbon. This is a Sitka spruce on the Olympic Peninsula, a very healthy tree, 300 years old or older, and continues to sequester a lot of carbon. This is a reminder how much we already lost along the coast. So in yellow, the logged areas, and there's more intact rainforest in the Great Bear region. Going to speed up a little bit because we want to talk about FERPA soon. This is a reminder about the beauty of the intact forest in the Great Bear region. So here we have a science-based system where we are setting aside 85% of the forest and about a third in protected areas. And then we have targets for setting aside old growth in every landscape outside of protected areas. You have all seen these maps showing the original old growth on the southern part of the coast and how little remains, and particular emphasis again on the productive old growth forest where the biggest trees can grow, and the low productivity forest in higher elevation. We have more of those old growth forests. They are not endangered because they are not of interest for industry, and we have very few percentage points left of those dark green old growth forests with the biggest trees. So right now, since the remaining percentages are shrinking so fast, but the logging rates remain stable, they disappear like melting snow in the spring. And we are losing the remaining old growth on Vancouver Island 3 times faster than tropical countries are losing their primary or intact rainforest. So between 1990 and 2015, we have lost 30% on Vancouver Island, and in tropical countries, they lost 10% of their primary forest. And you are all aware of, and I already mentioned this, the loss of the web of life, the diversity of species in young second growth forests here. So it's time for change. On Vancouver Island, we have an outdated land use plan. We have very high ecological risk for old growth ecosystems as we fall below the 30%, which is considered high risk. And we have status quo logging, and it's causing more and more damage for water, for clean air, for a diverse economy. The BC economy is changing, but we are still being told that this is the only way for the province to remain prosperous. First Nations are making progress in the courts. There are more and more court cases that show that what is happening today is against the law, is against Indigenous rights. So we have to speed up the process and make these changes. There's growing support as we see the old growth disappear, and people want to see, some of you already mentioned this, improved forest management everywhere, not just old growth protection. And we have learned a lot in the Great Bear Rainforest and some other parts of the province. The NDP did in fact promise during the election that they would take action in partnership with First Nations and communities, modernize land use planning, and take action for ecological values, including old growth, using the EBM model in the Great Bear Rainforest. So they're still talking about taking action, but they dropped the part about using science. Sorry, I'm getting a dry throat. I have to drink more. So I'm going to skip this. It's just a photo from the Clayoquot region where we have a solution coming. Maybe I take a moment for. So the solution for Vancouver Island, just very briefly, will require proposals for new protected areas. That will take time. So we need moratoria for some of these remaining intact areas. We often refer to them as hotspots, from the Walbrand to East Creek to the Namint, working with Indigenous peoples that are interested in increasing protection. And then we will need, sorry about that. We will need steps to protect endangered ecosystems using targets. So all these areas in red are those hardest hit. We have tiny percentage of good productive old growth, and those will require immediate phase out. And then we need a conversation about how quickly we can protect the remaining old growth and restore some of the second growth. So many of you have already taken action on rainforestisland.ca. Again, that's our call on the BC government to bring in Old Growth Protection Act or include old growth protection in existing forestry laws in the Forest Range and Practices Act. And this will require conservation solutions combined with support for First Nations governance and community well-being. A lot of funding is needed to support alternatives to logging and support for the forestry sector. So I just want to mention that just yesterday we had a media release about a report from the Environmental Law Center from Wieting about applying solutions from the Great Bear Rainforest to Vancouver Island, the South Coast and beyond. You can find it in our website, on our website. If you go to the media center at the bottom of our website, and it's calling for 30% minimum protection across the province in all landscapes for every ecosystem. And that would be one step in the right direction. The government could include, and you can include in your comments, as something that should be done as part of amending the law. This is not something that should be for discussion in all parts of the province as part of land use planning. Land use planning is important, but I don't think that communities should have to negotiate about the extinction of species. If the bar is too low, if we are allowing too much logging at a level where it is certain that plants and animals cannot survive, I think that should not be part of land use planning. I think we need forestry laws that set the bar at a minimum at a place where plants and animals have a fighting chance to survive. And then in addition, the different regions of the province, Vancouver Island and other parts of the province need a land use planning, a modern land use planning process where decisions are made. How fast can we protect more land to set aside habitat, cultural values, and have clean water, clean air, and a diverse economy. So let's move to the Forest and Range Practices Act. But I will take a moment to pause here for questions. I think these are all my slides. And I probably need to drink a lot of water because I have a very dry throat, so I apologize for that.
That's fine, Jens, and we just want to let you know that we have figured out how to put a speaker on here so everybody in the library is happy and can hear you.
Oh, that's awesome. How long did it take?
Not that long.
Do we have any questions right now?
There are no questions up right now. Oh, but we have a hand up. So one. The question is, can your presentation material be made available online somewhere after this?
Yeah, I will move it into a Dropbox folder and share the link with you, Megan and Monica, and then people can maybe get in touch with you.
Wonderful. And we have people's email addresses, and if people want to get in touch with us through the event page.
Could you repeat the solution there?
We have one more question.
Could you repeat the solution? Apply the Great Bear Rainforest something?
Could you
propose solutions? Okay.
Could you repeat what you said about the proposed solutions for the Great Bear Rainforest?
Yes, sure. So the Great Bear Rainforest agreements are based on ecosystem-based management. So a lot of science was developed in the early 2000s, particularly in the EBM handbook. So EBM stands for ecosystem-based management. And one of the key conclusions was that for temperate rainforest, we have to protect 70% of the natural level of old growth for every type of forest, whether it's higher elevation or lower elevation, different leading tree species and so on, to achieve low ecological risk. And this is what happened in the framework, that we have now targets that deliver 70% or more for most of the forest ecosystems, with a few exceptions. There are still massive problems implementing the system, so it's not all perfect in the Great Bear Rainforest at all, but the targets are sound, and 30% was considered the high risk threshold. So the other important number was that never allow logging of more than 30% of the different old growth ecosystems, of the original old growth, of course, at the landscape level. So landscape units are often 50 to 100,000 hectares. So there are more than 100 landscape units in the Great Bear Rainforest with targets, and on Vancouver Island and the South Coast, we have also over 100 landscape units. So one short-term step again that is being recommended by the Environmental Law Center is to let's use the 30% number, which is considered high risk, as a first step. The sad truth is that this would essentially mean that most of the old growth ecosystems with big trees that are of interest for industry would quickly become off limits of logging. Sad for industry because they logged too much in past decades, so there's not enough left. These ecosystems need a break. Older second growth must be allowed to grow old again, and we should manage the remaining young forests completely different to ensure that we get some of the old growth features back, allowing some of the remaining old trees to continue to grow rather than clear cutting everything and putting it back to zero. So that's the recommendation there, and it will come up again in a moment if I go through the web survey. So maybe we should do that next, and then we will hopefully still have a bit of time to for more questions.
Yeah, so why don't we? Okay, that doesn't work.
I'll do this. I'm just going to say Megan is our timekeeper. So we have about 30 minutes to go through the FERPA now, Jens.
Okay. So I hope you can now see the Sierra Club website. Do you see the Help Make BC's Forestry Laws Better? Is that on the screen now?
No, that's not on the screen now.
Okay.
You have to put your PowerPoint up.
Okay. So I will start this again.
While you're getting that up, I'm just going to mention that I see Eric is on here, Eric Piccola, and if you all get a chance to look back on the Facebook event page, Eric did a really great post there with a lot of information that you can use to fill out the survey. So just mention that. Thank you, Eric.
I don't know the chart is a key word.
So I hope it works now. Do
Yes,
you
that's working. We see it.
The Sierra Club website now?
Yes.
Okay. So now I want to scroll down here a little bit. So on our website, you will find bullet points for 8 questions, the link to the BC government website where they ask you 8 questions, and then you can use some of our bullet points to inform your suggestions, your perspective. You will also find at the bottom of this website a 9-page joint submission from 28 environmental groups with more detail if you want to read more. You will also find, I believe we have already included the link to the Environmental Law Center report here. If not, you can find it in our media center. So I think you can also Google Sierra Club BC Media Center to see all our media releases. And I often use them because almost all our forest-related media releases have a quick summary of some of the key issues. For example, a summary of the report I just mentioned. So I'm not sure if some of you will in fact attempt to do the survey while we go through the points, but I leave that up to you. I assume that some of you will simply listen, have questions, and do it later tonight or tomorrow. You have time until Monday. So here's the take the survey now. And so the first question is about opportunities and priorities for adapting forest management to a changing climate. Some of the 8 questions are overlapping a little bit. We have not seen a lot of many signs that the BC government is getting serious about real change, but there's definitely a little bit of awareness now in government that climate change means that we have to take action and we have to do things differently. We just have to make sure that they hear from as many British Columbians as possible, so that they feel encouraged to take action. So the bullet points here very briefly are about resilience. It's about increasing protection for resilient intact natural forests, particularly old growth, for carbon storage, for water, clean air, and species habitat. So resilience is an important theme, and it should be included as an objective in FERPA. We also suggest a climate impact test. So right now, forestry planning is based on the assumptions that things are pretty stable when it comes to weather and climate, but that's no longer the case. So even without destructive logging, we have more drought, we have more flooding, we have more fire, but destructive logging makes all of these things worse. So the government should immediately review existing plans and make adjustments to reduce these risks. So carbon is obviously super important, and they should make it an objective to increase carbon storage and reduce emissions. So this can be done by moving to selective logging, longer rotations, reducing wood waste, leaving more trees standing, and ending slash burning. It's really interesting that every time when we talk about slash burning, industry and government think about how, oh, we have to make sure that we remove everything from the forest and use it for energy or something else. But they really should start thinking about leaving more trees standing. If you are not sure that you need the tree, leave it standing and let it grow and sequester carbon. We should use this opportunity to end the spraying of deciduous trees. So many of you heard about glyphosate and how it's used to kill aspen and alder and plant more pine trees, and this is toxic for amphibians and other critters. And these deciduous trees can help as natural fire breaks, and they're an important source of food for wildlife. So the question 2 is in the context of fire risks. And there's some acknowledgement that yes, it's important to reduce the risk of fire, and in some cases this requires thinning and controlled burns, but it should never be used to justify clear cutting, which always exacerbates global heating. Is never the right answer. So in the plans to address fire management must protect ecological and cultural values and they must be developed with indigenous and non-indigenous communities, not by industry. Question 3 is about what information you think is necessary to support forestry planning. And there's a lot of information that's currently not being considered adequately. So we need detailed information mapping of the ecological, cultural, and economic values that are at risk when logging happens. How much really remains? The government is behind in terms of updating inventories, understanding the ecological values. We need a lot more information about the environment, about cultural values, and the economic values for tourism and recreation. Right now we have logging happening without understanding the negative economic impacts for long-term economic activity like tourism. And we have to move to science-based principles. Again, EBM is important here. All of this must happen in the context of full transparency and sharing all information that industry and government have. So question 4, how would you like to be involved in the planning process? This is a very high level question, and it's an invitation to highlight the importance to use the reform to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to make sure that we actually have time to do the analysis and the planning. This means we need moratoria. Right now, we have a lot of talk and log situations where we're sitting down maybe to discuss with government how much old growth remains. But even the most endangered old growth ecosystems continue to get logged while these processes are happening. So we need moratoria. And we need meaningful, timely opportunities for public engagement at all levels of forest planning, from regional to local levels. And very importantly, we need funding. We need a government that understands that we depend on these services. We need funding to protect more forest and enable solutions like coast funds. In the Great Barrier Rainforest, $120 million of coast funds were put together by private funders, federal government and provincial government, to support communities, to increase protection and allow economic alternatives to logging. Question 5 is again about important values. In this context, they're asking about road planning. So this is straightforward. We need more intact areas, left alone. We have to reduce fragmentation. We have tens of thousands of kilometers of resource road infrastructure, and we see there's no sound planning right now. Yes?
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Sure.
I would like to know from some of the people who are joining us online whether or not they're following through the survey at the same time we're going through this, because we have some paper copies here and the questions don't seem to be the same as the ones that you are going through from your website there. So for example, I have a paper copy here that looks a little bit different and it was printed out from the website. So I'm just wondering what other people online, if maybe a few other people could.
I think those questions are condensed, summarized.
There it is.
Of the actual questions.
Yes, so Jens, your questions, the ones on the Sierra Club website, are just condensed form of the ones that are on the website?
Yes.
Okay.
They are condensed. I don't recall 11 questions though, but okay, then you have to double check. Maybe they made a change. No,
I think it's 9 questions. Yeah,
okay.
It's 9 questions. Okay, thank you. Just wanting to check in on that. And I do see a few people answering here. Thanks.
So we didn't copy and paste the full questions. We used keywords from the questions. I think they are numbered questions, and hopefully that helps. But we definitely used identical keywords. We just wanted to keep it shorter a little bit. So I was just talking about road planning, and that's definitely question number 5, the last time I checked. So again, this is straightforward. It's about fewer roads, more careful planning, and again, road building can cause serious problems in landscapes, for example, landslide risks and steep slopes, and some of these risks are getting more severe with climate change, so we need more careful planning there. And more careful planning for species, because they are suffering in many ways from fragmentation, allowing predators, for example, to move quickly through landscapes that were previously safer for species like caribou. So lots of examples here and a few bullet points under question 5 you can use. And before I forget, a general comment, I hope that you will take a moment to read through, make some edits where you to make sure that you have a unique contribution. I think that can be done very easily if you add your own thoughts and perspectives to some of these. Maybe there's also something you disagree with or think is less important. I'm convinced that individual submissions, combining our suggestions with your own thoughts, will have a greater impact compared to copy and paste approach. So I want to move to question 6 here. Transparency and timelines of information sharing, very important, because right now we have a lot of forestry planning happening behind the scenes. So we need these timely opportunities at all levels of forestry. And we need, in particular, more detail in forest stewardship plans. They have been reviewed and criticized by the Forest Practices Board repeatedly. They're too superficial. They need revised objectives for species, for carbon, for climate impacts. And we need more time for the public to review them. So we're suggesting to double the time from 60 to 120 days. And we also need a mechanism that shows that public input is actually considered. So there must be, we need more transparency, and government has to demonstrate how they made changes in response to scrutiny. Question 7 is about information to inform your feedback on plans that may impact you. And this is again a little bit similar in terms of needing more information to be considered in planning. So we want forestry that really addresses the climate crisis. That means we need the ecosystem approach. We have to restore carbon storage and give species and ecosystems a chance to adapt to the changing climate, reduce dangers for communities. So in short, move away from the timber first approach. Herb Hammond often talks about how we have to move to a place where timber will become a byproduct of forestry, and the main task is to ensure stewardship for clean air, clean water, stable climate, and all these environmental services. And then we may still have some timber, but this really requires that we stop going with timber first. So I think this is all you need for question 7. And for question 8, the government is asking about additional values to allow for better management of forest and range practices. So here we have a very specific point. So currently, FERPA requires to address things like species habitat and other environmental values without unduly reducing the supply of timber from BC's forests. So this has undermined everything in FERPA, and it has to go. And instead, you can suggest that we should turn things around and insist that timber harvesting must not unduly reduce the resilience of ecosystems. But the most important thing is really to remove the timber constraint and to move to an acknowledgement that ecological integrity must come first. This is another opportunity to talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It should guide and inform all changes to the law. Carbon, biodiversity, and then two specific points: binding protection for big old growth trees with a buffer. This is what Brenda mentioned earlier. It's a scandal that we are still seeing trees that are 1,000 years old and very big trees cut down. And I recently came across a letter from an MLA, from Rob Fleming's staff, saying that BCTS has set aside 100 legacy trees and Western Forest Products 207. And they share this information with a straight face. 100 and 200, 300 big old trees were set aside. The BC government talked about big tree protection since 2011 for 7 or 8 years. They're still in a pilot project. They set aside 300 trees, and we have lost thousands, probably tens of thousands of big trees in the last 7 or 8 years. So this has to happen now. It's not the solution, but it's one step. And it must happen, including for those plans that are already made, because BC Timber says, when they cut down the tree in the Namin, they stated that, oh, those plans were already made before we moved to this pilot project. That's unacceptable. They can also include protection for bear dens. So we're losing all these old growth features. Anything that is bigger than a Christmas tree is removed in young forests. We need structures like big old trees, and in some cases the stumps as bear dens, and they can be protected with an objective, just like in the Great Bear Rainforest Order. Question 9, strengthening oversight and accountability. So this is obviously super important because, as you all know, the Liberal government moved to FERPA and gave up on the code, which had more regulation and clearer mechanisms. So they moved to professional reliance. They outsourced control to the logging companies, and we have to restore government capacity for oversight, for decision making, for monitoring and enforcement. So this is one of the most important things. Government has to restore at least to the levels where the BC government had some capacity to enforce 20 years ago, including research, inventories. There's so much has been lost. We need to restore this capacity. And we have to make sure the government is in charge, not companies. And this also means that the licensees, industry have to provide sufficient information. It cannot be superficial, and government has to use this information and their own inventory to make sound decisions. This will also require written reasons for the public to demonstrate how the objectives are being considered and how to ensure that all those logging operations and road building are consistent with the regulations and indigenous rights have been respected. Lastly, we need accountability, and we cannot have a situation just like a few years ago. I said to look this up the other day, when we had Canfor and West Fraser cutting down 1 million cubic meters of green timber in the damaged mountain pine beetle landscapes and walking away without a fine after taking 1 million cubic meters of green timber from those landscapes where they're only supposed to harvest damaged trees. So that's just one example of many. And I want to allow more time for questions here.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see any coming up on the chat. So do we have any here in the room right now?
I have a question about the violation, because
is it's pretty much across the board in corporations that doesn't work. I mean, is there any kind of way to up the ante on that? You know, on your first violation, you get a penalty. On the second violation, you lose your license and maybe for a death penalty.
The question in the room is about penalties for violations. Any way to make them stronger? Or is that something that we should be bringing up?
So they must be stronger, and I don't have examples or what they should be. Obviously, they should be. It would have to be a range of penalties depending on how severe the violations are. But I imagine that there's a lot of work to be done to have a relationship between the financial scope and scale of the fines and the damage caused. So right now we have a situation where the costs for our society are not measured. So we don't have any systems in place to understand just how expensive this is for communities when they lose the forest and the services, the values for tourism, for recreation, for clean water, and so on. And more work should be done. I think this is something that people can include, that the damage caused should be reflected in the fine.
I can talk about that briefly if you want. The only fines they get now is actually if they've left too much slash on the ground that is beyond what the utilization standards say they should be taking off the site. So there's no calculation of environmental damage or what's the cost to the water or anything like that, but they get fined, and they will pay the fine because it's cheaper to pay the fine than actually go back in and relog it and take more wood off the site. But that's the only fines that they get.
Thanks, Eric.
And of course, that doesn't apply on private land, only on crown land.
So the question here is there any way we can go beyond just fines? Is there something else that could be done? And then we have 2 more questions in the room here. So is there anything we can do beyond fines, Jens?
Well, I want the government to reform the law in such a way that we have strong mechanisms to prevent the damage before it happens. And this requires very detailed planning and strong government capacity to review the quality of the plan and enough time to make changes. So right now we have a rubber stamp approach, right, where everything, things go over the desk quickly because nobody has time to review whether the information is correct, to understand the impacts of the proposed logging. All of this has to change, and we cannot afford to lose these values. So they must be, the damage must be prevented early, and then we still need the strong enforcement regime with staff levels being restored in the government to have boots on the ground and make sure that things are actually happening as planned in the landscape.
Yeah, thanks, Jens. So we have another question. 1 second.
I'm not sure if this has been answered or not, but could we not just establish the goals of what we want and then work it back to define the policy after we define the goals?
Could we not just establish the goals first and then work backwards to eventually get policy in place? Is that basically your question, Jens?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but we definitely need additional objectives in FERPA so that we have stronger and more objectives addressing the environmental values. So right now we don't have something on carbon, for example, and maintaining the carbon sink and the carbon sequestration of our forest should be a standalone objective. So, and in other cases, we have objectives right now for biodiversity, for example, that are too weak and everything is trumped by timber. So So we have to make sure that the environmental services come first, the objectives for the environment and for carbon and other key services must come first, and then that should in fact translate to planning where timber is an output of planning after addressing all these values. And that's exactly what we talked about in the Great Bear Rainforest, where it's accepted that volume, cubic meters, must be an output of planning after addressing the environmental values. And this should happen across the province as a result of a new fir palm.
So yes, yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to jump in for a second. We have about 5 more minutes here at the library, and then we're going to have to shut down, and I've got a whole bunch of hands up. So I want to briefly say I'm going to put in the chat box your email address, because you said it was okay to do that. For people's questions that don't get asked tonight, if we get cut off, you can send them to Jens, and he promises to answer them when he's around. But I'm going to take a couple more questions here. If you can answer them maybe just in a nutshell. So there was somebody at the back.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any institutions or organizations that are actually doing some direct legal action.
Are there any institutions or organizations that are taking legal action right now to try to take care of some of these issues?
The short answer is that West Coast Environmental Law and Eco-Justice have the expertise, and they are often frustrated because many examples of egregious logging, when taking a closer look, are not illegal because the laws are so weak that it's difficult to prove illegal activities. So we need stronger laws very clearly, because we have very destructive logging, and most of it is legal because the laws are so weak.
Okay, thanks, Jens. And then there's a question over here.
You've said that you want the government to have oversight. Well, who would be actually responsible for oversight of the monitoring, enforcement, and
who in the government would actually be responsible for the oversight that you were speaking about? Who would be responsible for overseeing the monitoring and all of those things?
Eric, do you want to take this one and talk about which government branch with the different services?
Right. Well, it would need to be down to the district level, and you'd want to have your silviculture staff involved checking to see what's going on out there, but logging plan approvals, the cutting permits approvals, everybody at the local district level, and also you'd have compliance and enforcement, which there is a small branch left, but it used to be in every district that the people who were doing timber harvesting inspections used to go out and do client.
We can't hear you, Eric. We can't hear you. Can you go closer to your mic, please?
You can't hear me at all? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better.
Better there, okay? Sorry. So anyway, there used to be...
No,
you have to put it on your ears, apparently.
How about that? Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have about 30 seconds, Eric.
Okay, compliance and enforcement, you'd have it at the district level, and it would be that you want to make sure that everybody are out there and doing those inspections. You want to give that abilities to the local districts, and then have a compliance enforcement branch, and those people are involved in all the different business areas, looking after cutting permits and silviculture, checking post-harvesting what's going on those sites from those approved sites. So, yeah.
Thanks. We have another question. Brenda had a question, and then we have a question at the back. Brenda, what was your question?
I just have some comments, actually. My concern is about private land. There is 232,000 hectares removed from ground to public land.
Hang on 1 second. They can't hear you, Brenda, so it has to go through me.
Okay.
So say slowly.
Okay.
That's the next survey, though.
Are you talking about private lands?
Yeah.
Okay, so
my concern is about private lands, because it doesn't matter what we say in the survey, it's not going to impact that. That's my first thing.
Okay, so Brenda has a concern about private lands, but there's another survey that is coming up about that, so we'll mention that in a second. And what was your second comment?
I just want to say that UNDRIP
failed
the Senate. So, which would have led to harmonization of UNDRIP Canadian law. So that was recently.
The Senate rejected it.
The Senate rejected UNDRIP recently, so that's just a point to be made.
My point is global attention.
Global attention. Can we put some global attention?
Countries know what's going on. I'm sure that globally
Yeah.
people are interested.
That's a good question.
See trees, and is there
Yeah.
organizations out there we can connect with
Okay.
that could bring attention to the slaughter that's going on?
So to
There
put,
was a report recently, there's a group in Switzerland that came out and they suggested that we could completely solve the climate issues if we planted X number of trees in
Right.
Canada. It was very
so we're having a discussion here on the side about what could be done globally. So because there's not enough time during this chat now to answer that, I think that's something that perhaps could be, that maybe Jens or Eric could email to me and I could put up on the Facebook event page as an answer to that question, what can be done globally. We have one more question and about 30 seconds to answer it. It was at the back corner there.
Well, I was just going to comment on the conflict between shoving or monitoring everything over in the government while they have a logging arm.
Right, so this is the question about, isn't there a conflict when the government is supposed to be monitoring things and yet they have the arm of government called BCTS, which is out there logging? Is there not a conflict? Can we get an answer to that in the next 30 seconds from Jens, maybe?
Yeah, there's not a simple one. BC Timber Sales should be an agency that showcases best practices. Instead, it's one of the worst operators. The list of scandals they're involved is too long to share here. So we have to work really hard to either get this thing changed or it should disappear. There's no strong reason for BC Timber Sales to exist unless it becomes a leader. But there's absolutely a conflict, and we're seeing it every day because they're not listening, even in the most extreme cases. And this is a fight. The government will wants to make changes in early 2020. It's more than 6 months away. Monday, 4 p.m. is the last moment to submit your comments. And then in the coming months, we have to keep the pressure up to make sure that they actually feel the pressure to make real changes, not just tinkering around the edges. And stay in touch with Sierra Club BC, with other organizations about upcoming opportunities to keep the pressure up.
So Jens, we want to say thank you very much to you for joining us and to the Sierra Club for all of the hard work that they do. So thank you so much. We're going to have to end this fairly quickly, but I want to say a couple of other things. So first of all, the big thank you to Jens. And we're sorry that it took so long at the beginning to get things going, but for the next one, hopefully we've learned something, so we'll make it happen faster. I want to let everybody know that apparently 1,200 surveys have already been completed and submitted to the ministry. And there'll be more since we heard about that. So we have that from a very, very good source. From the same source, we understand that it would be really important for everyone to mention somewhere on their survey that there should be a way to strengthen government's ability to sustainably manage Crown lands, that apparently those words are very important. And just mentioning again that it is important to make some personal statements in there. I've put Jens's email up, and apparently tonight they thought maybe we'd be crashing their system with so many surveys being submitted all at once. So go ahead, everybody, and submit your surveys as soon as you think they sound really great.
And
because
they can save them and do them.
And Monica, you
yes,
can
Eric.
also put my email address in too, and if people have questions about, like, say, the Comox Valley and the watersheds out there, I know those quite well, and people can ask other questions like that too of me.
Eric, can you please just put your email into the chat box right now, and then everybody will get it. So I want to also mention that you can begin your surveys and you can press a button that says to save for later. So if you've started it while Jens was speaking, please press the save and then finish it afterwards. Also, I left an email there for those of you who'd rather just send an email in. You don't want to fill out a survey. You can do that as well. If you look in the chat right now, it's engage.ferpa@gov.bc.ca. You can send in your submissions that way. I'm going to quickly add a few more things to the chat box before we end here, because the Yellow Point Ecological Society, that's Guy Dauncey, the Wilderness Committee, and a bunch of other places have also, like Wild Site and so on, have put information out to help us to fill out these surveys. So our little group here is planning on doing something else like this, hopefully, in time for the private managed forest lands survey that is coming out as well. So please stay tuned on Facebook. If you're interested in that, we're going to be inviting Eddie Petrushin from WildSite to come in and do a similar thing to what Jens did for us today. So I think I've kind of touched on everything. I'll put a few things still into chat just before we close down. And once again, thanks everybody. And thank you all for joining us here.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. Nothing would happen without you. We really need every one of you. Thanks again.